I signed custody papers to give away my children at my own birthday party in front of 50 witnesses, and my father-in-law thought he'd finally destroyed me. What he didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I'd received a job offer that would turn his family betrayal into the biggest mistake of his life. My name is Robert Martinez, and this is the story of how a wealthy grandfather's revenge plot backfired so spectacularly that it destroyed his reputation, united an entire community against him, and gave me the perfect family drama karma story that proves sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone hang themselves with their own rope. When Frank Davidson handed me that envelope at Romano's restaurant, cameras rolling and reporters watching, he expected me to break down and beg. Instead, I smiled, signed those papers, and said the 5 words that would haunt him forever. This timing is absolutely perfect. You see, while he was busy collecting evidence of my failures, bribing teachers for negative reports, and turning my sister-in-law against me, I was quietly securing a $72,000 resort management position in Colorado that would make his custody case crumble like a house of cards. But the real twist came when the entire restaurant erupted in applause. My daughter finally saw through his manipulation, and his own daughter turned against him in court. This Reddit-worthy family revenge story gets better with every minute. But let me take you back to where this all started. Maria, my wife of 16 years, had been the heart of our family. Cancer stole her at 45. I walked with her through every treatment, every sleepless night. I left my accounting job to care for her full-time draining savings, selling what we could. By the time she passed, I had 2 children who barely recognized stability and debts stacked higher than my pride could reach. Returning to the corporate world felt impossible. Spreadsheets and quarterly reports seemed meaningless when Emma cried herself to sleep or when Tyler called out for his mother in the dark. So I took a job at Romano's restaurant. It wasn't prestigious, but it allowed me to be there for my kids. Presence over prestige. That was Maria's mantra, and I lived by it. But Frank never saw sacrifice as strength. To him, I wasn't a father. I was a failure. At Maria's funeral reception, he cornered me in the kitchen. She deserved better than this, he muttered, gesturing at my modest house. Her worry over money killed her as much as the illness. I was too numb to respond, but the words dug deep, festering. In the months after Frank's criticisms sharpened, at Sunday dinners he'd ask Emma about college. Stanford impressive, he'd say, then glance at me. But it's $80,000 a year. How will you make that happen? Or to Tyler, you've got talent, son. Competitive leagues could take you far, but they're expensive. Has your dad looked into that? They weren't questions. They were indictments. And my children, still reeling from their mother's death, absorbed every one. The car rides home after those dinners were suffocating. Emma would stare out the window silent. Tyler would fidget his face, a storm of thoughts he couldn't yet articulate. Finally, one night, Tyler asked the question I dreaded Dad. Why does Grandpa say, I can't take care of us? I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Grandpa is grieving too, I said carefully. Sometimes when people are sad, they say things that aren't fair. He nodded, but looked unconvinced. Emma was less subtle. Late one night, I found her at the kitchen table, college brochures scattered. Her eyes were red. It's impossible, she whispered. Even state schools cost more than we can afford. Maybe Grandpa's right. Maybe I need different opportunities. The phrase was Frank's word for word. Hearing it from her cut me open. I sat beside her. We'll find a way. Scholarships, financial aid, hard work. Money isn't everything. She looked at me with love, but also frustration. You try so hard, Dad, but sometimes trying isn't enough. Those words echoed long after she went to bed. Elena, Maria's sister, was another battle I didn't expect. At first, she defended me. She'd tell Frank to back off, remind him how I had cared for Maria. But over time, his words seeped into her too. One evening, she called. Her voice was low, conflicted. Robert, are you sure you can keep this up? 2 kids' bills work. Frank keeps saying the kids need more stability, and sometimes I wonder if he's right. My chest tightened. Presence matters. I'm here every day. Doesn't that count? It does, she admitted. But will it be enough when Emma wants Stanford? When Tyler needs more than encouragement? Her words were knives because they weren't shouted. They were whispered, trembling, the kind of doubts you can't shake. Frank escalated. He started buying Emma new textbooks, paying for Tyler's shoes. He framed it as generosity, but I knew the truth. Every gift was a wedge. Robert, he told me one evening, glancing around my cramped apartment, it's no wonder Emma struggles to study here. She needs space. Quiet. Not this. I bit my tongue. But later that night, Emma asked softly, Dad, do you think I'll ever have a room like the ones in the brochures? Someday, I promised. But the way her eyes dimmed told me she didn't believe me. The worst blow came when I discovered Emma had been meeting with Frank and a lawyer. She told me afterward, her voice defensive but guilty, I just wanted to know my options. Grandpa thinks maybe he can help more than you can. I felt something break inside me. My daughter lured into believing she needed saving from her own father. When I confronted Elena, she admitted she knew. I didn't think he'd go this far, she whispered. I thought it was just talk. I didn't stop him because I wasn't sure he was wrong. Her honesty was almost worse than a lie. The evidence mounted. One Saturday, I found a folder Frank had prepared photographs of our apartment notes about missed pickups, Emma's grades, highlighted in red. In the margins, Elena's handwriting appeared small details she had given him. He wasn't criticizing anymore. He was building a case. That night, I sat alone by Maria's photo. Am I enough? I whispered. He thinks I'm failing them. Some days I wonder if he's right. The silence that answered was unbearable. And then came the invitation. Frank called, his voice syrupy. Let's celebrate your birthday at Romano's. A family affair. I'll bring friends, maybe even some reporters. The children should see us supporting you. It wasn't support, it was a stage. When I told Elena, she hesitated. Maybe it's his way of making peace, she suggested weakly. Or maybe it was the perfect place for a public execution. I didn't say yes for me. I said yes because Emma's eyes lit up at the idea of something festive, and Tyler chirped about balloons and cake. They deserved joy, even if the invitation reeked of venom. On the night of my birthday, Romano's glowed with lights and decorations. Staff I had worked alongside for years cheered as I walked in. For a moment, I almost let myself believe it was real. But then, I saw Frank's friends from the country club, reporters with cameras ready, and I knew. This wasn't a party. It was the trap closing. Frank stood glass raised high. Tonight we honor Robert Martinez, a man who has done his best. And tonight we also honor Emma and Tyler, who deserve a future worthy of their potential. The applause was polite, staged. Emma lifted her phone, smiling nervously. Then Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a large envelope. He held it like a prize. My gift, he announced, for the children's future. I took it, opened it, and saw again those familiar words, petition for emergency custody. Evidence stacked behind it. The room gasped. Emma's eyes widened. Tyler shrank into his chair. I picked up the pen, signed cleanly, and slid the document back. This timing is perfect. The silence was thick, every person holding their breath. Frank's smile faltered just slightly, as if he realized he had underestimated me. The battle lines were drawn. The trap had been sprung, and soon it would be him caught in it, not me. The weeks after my birthday invitation felt like walking through fog. Nothing exploded, nothing crashed, but every step was colder, quieter, and more uncertain than the one before it. Frank didn't attack me head-on. He didn't need to. He worked in the shadows, slipping under doors, and through phone lines, whispering doubt into places I couldn't reach. He started with favors that looked harmless. Emma came home with a new set of SAT prep books I hadn't bought. Tyler's feet landed in cleats that cost more than our weekly groceries. I'd find gift cards taped inside their notebooks. A casual grandpa said this might help. When I confronted him, he never raised his voice. He just smiled like a man who'd learned to win by keeping his hands clean. "I'm helping where you can't, Robert," he said one afternoon in the hallway outside my apartment. He looked past me into the narrow living room as if scanning a report for errors. No shame in that. It's what family is for. Help is fine, replacing me isn't, I said. He shrugged. If you were truly replaceable, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He left with that line, a parting shot that disguised contempt as reason. At school, the ripples showed. Tyler's soccer coach pulled me aside after practice. "He's a good kid," he said, nodding toward my son as he ran drills with his team. "He wants more training. Says his grandpa knows a club that could take him. He's anxious he'll fall behind if he doesn't start now." "I'm working on it," I said, because that's what fathers say when the truth feels too small. The coach clapped my shoulder. "He plays hard. Keep him in the game however you can." Emma's English teacher requested a meeting. She was kind, steady-eyed, the sort of person who spoke in complete thoughts. "She is bright," she said, "but she's carrying weight that has nothing to do with Shakespeare. She worries about money when she should be worrying about ideas. Is there anything we can do to ease that?" I wanted to tell her I had a plan that would make everything better, but at the time, I had nothing except 2 hands and every minute of every day. At home, even silence got heavy. Emma spent more time at the library or at Elena's, where Frank always seemed to materialize right when it was time to talk about the future. Tyler watched me like I had answers I was keeping in a jar somewhere, saving for a special occasion. Elena called one night, her voice low, late enough that her words arrived stripped of their armor. "I know you're doing everything you can," she said, "but are you sure you can keep this up? 2 kids rent, school, fees? Frank keeps saying the kids need more stability, and sometimes I wonder if he's right." "Presence matters," I said sharper than I meant to. "I'm here every day." "Does that count for nothing?" "It counts," she said, and I believed she meant it. But will it be enough when Emma is staring at Stanford tuition? When Tyler needs a league you can't afford? That's what I don't know. I wanted to argue, to list every overnight shift I'd traded for a morning at the school office, every holiday I'd cut short to get Tyler to a game, every small joy I'd fought to give them, with little more than grit and a worn-out calendar. But listing sacrifices doesn't turn them into money. It just makes you hear how tired you sound. The first open crack came on a Saturday. Emma said she was studying with friends. I didn't doubt her. She'd become a creature of schedules and highlighters, a girl who treated time like a ladder no one else could climb for her. I headed downtown to pick up supplies for Romano's. A law office sits on the corner across from the bakery I use on weekends. As I waited for the light, I looked through the window just in time to see my daughter sitting across from Frank, and a man in a dark suit, a neat spread of papers between them. I didn't go in. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, long enough for the cold to reach my bones. And when she came home that night, I let her speak first. It was just a conversation, she said, defensive and apologetic at once. Grandpa wanted me to hear the options. He says there are programs, scholarships, funds I don't know about. He says a different home could help with college admissions. Different home, I repeated. The phrase tasted like dust. And this conversation didn't need me because she swallowed. I didn't want to hurt you if it didn't mean anything. What does it mean? It means I'm scared, she said. And finally she sounded 16 again. I don't want to spend the next 4 years apologizing for being poor. You're not an apology, I said, but the answer didn't fix anything. It just sat there, true and useless. I called Elena after Emma went to bed. You knew, I said, not accusing, just naming. I didn't think he'd take her, she said. I thought he would talk big and then stop. I should have stopped him. I didn't. I'm sorry. Not stopping is agreeing, I said, and she didn't argue. A week later, I opened a folder Emma had left on the counter and found myself staring at a map of my life drawn by someone who wasn't planning on living it. photos of our apartment building, screenshots of my work hours, notes on the nights Emma went to Elena's because I was working late, and the mornings Tyler was 10 minutes late to school. A printout of Emma's grades, every B circled like a blemish. In the margins, Elena's handwriting, small details only family can provide. I closed it, put it back exactly where I'd found it, and sat in the quiet until it felt like the walls were listening. In the hallway, Maria's photo hung where I'd left it the day we moved in. I stood there longer than I meant to. If you're watching, I told her I'm trying. I don't know if trying is enough. The day after that, Frank showed up at Romano's for lunch. He'd never liked eating there. He always said the food was too loud. But he took a corner table and waited until I came over with the check. "I'm hosting your birthday here," he said. He pushed a hand across the air like he was smoothing a wrinkle only he could see. "A proper family celebration. I've invited friends, a couple people from the paper. They should see what kind of man you are." "What kind is that?" I asked. "The kind who shows up," he said. "We'll honor that." "Is that all we're honoring?" He smiled. "Come now, let me do one good thing you won't resent." When I told Elena, she hesitated the way a person does when their first answer is no, but they're looking for a way to say yes. "Maybe it's a peace offering," she said. "Maybe he wants to show support." "By inviting reporters?" I asked. She exhaled. "I'll talk to him." But talking to Frank never meant changing his mind. It meant finding ways to sit comfortably inside his decisions. At home, Emma brightened at the idea of the party. She planned decorations with Elena, whispered over her phone, her face lit by secrets she thought were kind. Tyler asked about cake, about candles, about whether he could invite his friend from soccer. It should have made me happy. Instead, I felt cornered inside a celebration meant to make me look grateful, while someone else wrote the captions. I started sleeping badly, not because of what Frank might do, that part I understood, but because of what my children might believe if I couldn't stop him. There's a version of fatherhood no one talks about where your job isn't to fix the world, but to stand still while it tries to knock you over so your kids can see what it looks like when something holds. On a Wednesday, a reporter I knew from the paper called me on my break. "I hear there's a birthday at Romano's this weekend," she said. "Big turnout. You know anything about that?" "Enough," I said. "Off the record," she added, and I could hear her pen click a metronome for the space between people and their stories. "Is this a celebration or a statement?" "Both," I said. "But you'll have to decide which kind." She laughed softly. "Fair enough. See you there." At the end of that shift, Mr. Romano caught me at the back door. He's a quiet man who believes in good silverware and short speeches. "You okay?" he asked. "I've been better," I said. He nodded like I'd told him the specials were out of stock. "We'll keep it clean," he said. "You have people here. Remember that." The day before the party, Emma baked a cake with Elena in the church kitchen and came home with frosting on her sleeve. She looked happy in a way I hadn't seen since before Maria got sick. It ripped something and healed something at the same time. "Grandpa says he's got a surprise," she said as she set the cake in our fridge. "He said it's for our future." I didn't react fast enough to hide my face. She saw it. "Dad," she said softer now, "can you please try for one night? No fighting, no sighing, no whatever this is." She traced a circle in the air around my shoulders, like she was outlining a man she wanted to be proud of without having to defend him. "I can try," I said, and meant it. That night, Tyler crawled into my bed like he hadn't in years. He tucked his feet under my leg and whispered, "Are you nervous?" "Yeah," I said, "a little." "What if it's not bad?" he asked. "Then we get a good night," I said. "Those happen too." He fell asleep fast. I stayed awake counting the ways a man could lose his children while still living in the same town. The morning of the party, I shaved with a carefulness that felt ceremonial. I put on the best shirt I owned, the one Maria had bought for me, with a coupon and a grin. Emma wore a dress Elena bought her months ago, a blue, that made her look like she belonged to the sky. Tyler wore a button-down he called his important shirt. Elena arrived to help carry gifts and make sure we were on time. At the door, she paused, looked at me, and said, "If this goes wrong, I'll fix what I can." "That's not how this works," I said, and I don't think I meant it unkindly. but I'm glad you came. On the drive to Romano's, my phone buzzed with messages from the staff. We're ready. We saved the back room. We put real candles in. It felt like a net I hadn't realized I needed. The restaurant was already humming when we walked in. Balloons gathered in the corner, like a small, cheerful storm. Streamers ran across the doorway to the private dining room. Customers clapped when they saw me, some because they knew me. Some because clapping is what you do when you think you're part of someone's happy moment. Frank's friends from the country club stood near the bar drinking wine and smiling the sort of smile you save for charity galas. 2 reporters I recognized slipped along the wall, cameras ready. Frank stood at the head of the long table like a man who'd practiced. "Robert," he called out, and his voice carried. "Happy birthday." He hugged Emma, patted Tyler's shoulder, shook my hand like we were partners in something noble. He asked a busboy to bring in a display of wrapped boxes that weren't a surprise to anyone who had ever seen a stage set before curtain. Dinner went by in chapters, toasts, laughter, stories about Maria that made even Frank soften briefly around the eyes. Every time I thought we might coast to the end without damage, he'd ask a question that reset the room. "How's the tutoring going, Emma?" he'd ask. And she'd light up with gratitude for a gift I couldn't match. "How's that new league look, Tyler?" he'd add. And my son would nod furiously, then look at me as if to check whether he was allowed to be happy. I held steady. I refused to make their joy a referendum on my worth. When cake had been served and coffee poured, Frank tapped a spoon against his glass. The room quieted, the way rooms do when they're trained to. He lifted a large, crisp envelope, the paper thick enough to look important even from a distance. "A final gift," he said. "Not just for Robert, but for Emma and Tyler, for their future." Emma raised her phone, smiling through nerves. Tyler leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, like a boy waiting for a birthday trick. Frank handed me the envelope. He watched my face, searching for the moment he could call victory by name. I opened it, saw what I expected to see, and felt the world slow down to the exact pace of my breath. Petition for emergency custody, evidence tucked behind it. The story of our lives told in sterile pages by a man who'd never been awake at our kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a crying teenager and a math book. I heard chairs shift. Someone coughed. A glass clinked too hard against a plate. I looked up at Frank and saw not a grandfather, not a father, not even a man. I saw pride, dressed in its Sunday best. I picked up a pen, signed, and set the papers neatly in front of me. This timing is perfect, I thought, and the words slid out evenly. This timing is absolutely perfect. A hush moved through the room like a tide pulling back from shore. Emma's phone lowered. Tyler's hands curled. Frank's smile flickered just enough for me to know he hadn't forecast this weather. He had invited an audience. He had built a stage. He had rehearsed his lines. He just hadn't considered the possibility that someone else might have written an ending he couldn't control. The silence in Romano's private dining room was heavy enough to bend the air. My signature sat on the petition like a mark of surrender. But I stood steady, refusing to give Frank the satisfaction of seeing me break. Frank raised his glass with the smoothness of a practiced speaker. "You see, everyone, Robert has finally admitted what we all know. He cannot provide the future these children deserve. Tonight, on his own birthday, he has chosen to do the right thing." Gasps spread across the tables. Emma's phone trembled in her hands. Tyler looked at me, his eyes wide, his voice cracking. "Dad, is that true? Are you giving us away?" I reached over and placed my hand on his, squeezing gently. "No, son, that's not what this means." The crowd leaned in, caught between shock and curiosity. Frank took the silence as permission to continue. "These children deserve stability," he said, his words aimed at the reporters' pens. "Robert is a kind man, but kindness does not pay tuition. Love does not get Emma into Stanford. Showing up at soccer games is nice, but it doesn't buy Tyler a place in a serious league. Presence is not enough." He said it like a sermon, sharp and rehearsed. Emma's lip trembled. She lowered her phone slightly, her recording shaking. Elena across the table sat rigid, her own phone slipping from her hand. Her face was pale, eyes darting as though she finally realized what she had helped set in motion. I rose from my chair, slow and deliberate, letting the scrape of wood against tile cut through the silence. "Are you finished, Frank?" "I've only just begun," he said with a smirk. "This is about reality, and reality is something you cannot afford." I let his words hang there. Then I looked around the room at the waitresses, who had seen me balance double shifts, at the customers who had watched me cheer Tyler's games, at the friends who had seen me carry Emma's books through rainstorms. "You all know me," I said, voice clear. "You know who's been there. Every homework assignment, every scraped knee, every late-night shift traded for time with these kids, that's reality too." A murmur swept through the crowd. The Romano staff clapped quietly, then louder, until the applause filled the corners Frank thought he owned. Frank slammed his hand on the table. "This is not a popularity contest. You can't pay for college with applause." Emma startled at the noise, dropping her phone onto the table. She stared at him, her grandfather, the man she had trusted, and saw not a savior, but an executioner. Frank pressed harder. He held up the packet of papers, flipping through the highlighted grades, the photos of our apartment. "Here is proof: missed pickups, late homework B's circled in red. This is the reality of a man failing his children. This is evidence." The reporters scribbled faster. Cameras clicked. The tension stretched until it was almost unbearable. Frank turned to me, his voice dripping with false pity. "Tell them, Robert. Tell them how you plan to pay $80,000 a year for Stanford. With what? With hugs." The crowd tensed. A few gasps, a few embarrassed chuckles. He leaned in further. "Tell them how Tyler is going to get into a competitive league. By you clapping from the bleachers." Emma's chest rose and fell. Her hands shook. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. Memories poured back, nights when I sat beside her at the kitchen table, long after midnight, editing essays while my eyes blurred with exhaustion. Mornings when I packed Tyler's lunch before racing to my shift, tying her shoes when she was too tired to move. Frank hadn't seen those moments, but she had. Every one of them. Her chair scraped back loudly. She stood, tears streaming, voice breaking but strong. "Stop it," she cried. "Grandpa, stop. This was never about helping us. This was about you proving Dad wasn't good enough, but he is. He always has been." The room froze, not silent in shock this time, but heavy with shame. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, chairs scraping. Others dropped their gazes, unwilling to look at Frank. Tyler jumped up beside his sister, his voice cracking. "Dad is the one who's always here, not you. You show up with money, but he shows up with us." The applause came suddenly, bursting like glass breaking. Romano's staff clapped, then customers joined, then the reporters lifted their cameras higher to capture the moment, children standing with their father, rejecting the wealth that had tried to buy them. Frank's face turned crimson. He pointed at Emma, his voice trembling with fury. "Ungrateful girl, you don't understand what I'm doing for you." "No," she said, tears glistening but steady. "I understand perfectly, and I don't want it." He spun on Elena, desperate. "Say something. Tell them this isn't how it looks." Elena's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted to me, then to Emma, then to Frank. Finally, her shoulders sagged. "Father, please, enough." The reporters swarmed, snapping photo after photo. The story was no longer his to tell. I stepped forward, calm but firm. "You wanted me humiliated tonight. You wanted me broken. But all you did was show everyone exactly who you are. And now the truth isn't just in this room, it's going out into the world." The applause thundered again. Emma wrapped her arms around me, sobbing. Tyler clung to my waist, looking up with pride instead of fear. The reversal was complete. The petition lay on the table, my signature still fresh, but its power was gone. Frank had lost not only the room, but the very people he claimed to protect. He sank back into his chair, pale with rage, muttering under his breath. His empire of pride had cracked. But the fight wasn't over. Court still waited. He still had lawyers' money and arrogance to burn. Yet in that moment, standing with my children, I knew the confrontation was mine to win. That night, long after the guests left and the lights dimmed, I walked back through the empty dining room. The decorations still hung streamers, sagging balloons, slowly deflating. Romano's smelled of garlic and coffee, but what lingered strongest was the echo of applause, the sound of a community that had chosen sides. Mr. Romano came up behind me, setting a hand on my shoulder. "He tried to bury you," he said simply. "Instead, you planted roots." I knotted my throat tight. In the distance, Frank's voice carried faintly as he argued with Elena in the parking lot. His words were sharp, hers trembling. I didn't need to hear more. The world had already decided. The confrontation was over. But revenge, the sweet, quiet kind that doesn't roar but reshapes everything, was still to come. The applause in Romano's refused to die, rolling through the private dining room in waves until the sound felt like a shield I hadn't known I needed. People who'd watched me bust tables and cover double shifts were on their feet clapping like they could pull me the last few inches out of a hole I hadn't dug. The reporters traded a quick look that said the headline had just written itself. Frank had walked into my birthday with a petition. He was walking out with a public reckoning. Emma's arms were around my waist, her cheek pressed to my chest. Tyler wedged himself in on the other side, the three of us, a knot no one could loosen. Across the table, Frank sat rigid and gray, the muscles in his jaw jumping. He had choreographed this night right down to the final toast, but he hadn't accounted for a room full of witnesses choosing a different ending. One of the waitresses called from the back, voice bright with defiance. "We've watched him raise those kids. You can't take them from their dad." The room broke into laughter and cheers. Not cruel, just clear. The kind of sound that settles a question. Elena dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. She had always been careful, always balancing duty and doubt. Tonight the scales slipped. She looked at me, at Emma, at the petition lying open, and I saw something fragile snap. Not rage, not grandstanding, just the quiet collapse of self-deception. Her phone, still recording, lay face up on the table, the red light blinking at a story that had outgrown its frame. "Are we really moving to Colorado?" Emma whispered, pulling back to search my face. "Yes," I said, "we are. We're starting fresh." Tyler tilted up at me, smiling through the tears he pretended weren't there. "Do they have the big leagues there? Can I try out?" "You're going to have a coach who tells you to slow down sometimes," I said, and he laughed for the first time that night. Frank lurched to his feet, gripping the table as if the wood could steady him. "This is not finished," he snapped. "A letter of intent isn't a paycheck. A salary isn't a report card. Judges don't clap for speeches. They look at facts." "Good," I said. "Then let them look. Let them see who's been here and who shows up only to take." He started to speak again, but his voice cracked. He swallowed it and sat. The reporters, sensing there was nothing left to add, angled to catch a last photo of the petition beside the job offer letter. It turned out the stark contrasts needed no caption. When the room thinned and the lights dimmed, Mr. Romano rested a hand on my shoulder. He tried to make this a eulogy, he said. "We made it a toast." "Thank you," I said, "because sometimes 2 words are all the strength you can carry." "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank your kids. They knew where to stand." That night, after Emma and Tyler went home with Elena to avoid one more scene in the parking lot, I sat alone at a corner table while the last of the staff folded chairs and untied the streamers. Romano's smelled like garlic and coffee and victory. Frank's voice floated in from outside, low and furious, but it didn't reach me. For the first time in months, I felt air in my lungs that didn't hurt. By morning, the story had spread. The local paper ran a photo of the petition on the white linen, my signature neat and unshaken, Emma's phone on the table, mid-recording the headline, "Matter of fact and devastating birthday custody play backfires, community rallies behind single father." At the country club, people skimmed the article over omelets, and vanished behind their napkins when Frank walked in. He had lived so long on approval that neglect cut deeper than open scorn. But he had lawyers. He had money. He had the appetite for a second fight. The courtroom would not clap. It would measure. And I would have to stand in a place where applause did not help me. Sarah Blake, my attorney, met me in her office 2 days later and went through everything in a voice that showed she trusted both the law and the parts of people that still believed in it. They will come in hard on stability, she said. They'll argue past performance. We argue present capacity and consistent care. Your job offer changes the math. Your history changes the story. What about Emma's grades? The late pickups? The photos I asked? We don't pretend they didn't happen, she said. We put them where they belong. Grief has seasons. So does healing. At the first hearing, the courtroom smelled like old wood and paper, like seriousness. Frank sat at the petitioner's table in a suit sharp enough to cut with an attorney named Whitaker, who looked like he'd been born with a briefcase. Elena sat in the row behind them, hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles blanched. She didn't look at me not because she refused, but because looking would dissolve her. Judge McAllister walked in like someone who had no time to waste, but a lifetime's worth of patience, if you respected her time. She was in her 60s, keen-eyed, stone calm. We rose, we sat. Whitaker stood. He started where men like him always start, with paper. He laid out the photos of our apartment building, the highlighted report cards, the notes about tardies that turned 10 minutes into a narrative. He quoted teachers without their paragraphs. He traced a line from my choice to care for my dying wife, to my failure to provide, as though love were a flaw on a ledger. He didn't sneer. He didn't need to. The condescension was built into the structure of the case. When he finished, Sarah did not clear her throat. She just stood and spoke like sunlight finds a window. Your Honor, Mr. Martinez did something that looks like failure on paper and like fatherhood in real life. He left his career to care for a wife dying of cancer. He lost income, yes. He also held his family together. That is not negligence. That is sacrifice. And sacrifices have consequences. So does resilience. She held up the letter I had folded and refolded in my pocket. He now has a full-time position as resort operations manager at Grand Vista Resort. $72,000 a year benefits housing stipend. He is not just hopeful, he is employed. Then the witnesses. Emma's English teacher, a woman with kind hands and a spine of iron, spoke of late-night emails and early morning meetings of a father who arrived with questions and left with action items. She did not gloss over the dip in grades. She set it squarely in the year a girl buried her mother and learned grief is a weight you bench press without a coach. Tyler's coach kept it simple. He shows up, he said. He's there when it's raining, when the scoreboard is ugly, when the roster is cruel. The kid plays like someone is in his corner, because someone is. Whitaker tried to turn their words. Showing up is admirable, he said, but it isn't a plan. Sarah didn't look at him. She looked at the judge. It is step 1. The job is step 2. Together, they are more than a plan. They are a life. Then Elena stood. No one had called her. No one had to. She looked small but unshakable as she asked to speak. Whitaker started to object. Judge McAllister raised a hand, and the objection died before it could embarrass itself. Elena looked at me first. There was apology there and resolve. Then she looked at the judge. My father asked me for details, she said. He asked for dates, for schedules, for little things that when stacked would look like a failure. I gave them to him. I thought I was protecting my niece and nephew. I was wrong. What I saw at the restaurant, what I've seen for years, is a man who traded titles for bedtime stories, promotions, for parent-teacher conferences, quiet for care. I won't help tear that down again. Frank hissed her name like a warning. She continued without flinching. If the court needs me, I will testify to my part in the scheme and to Mr. Martinez's care. This petition is not about the children, it is about pride. There was no murmuring this time, only a stillness that felt like respect. Whitaker tried to patch the hole with procedure. Grandparent rights exist for a reason, he began, but the judge had heard enough. She leaned forward, voice even and edged with steel. Mr. Davidson, the law allows grandparents to petition when there is neglect, abuse, or abandonment. What I see here is a father who chose caregiving over career when his wife was dying, who kept his children sheltered in the storm, who now stands with stable employment and the support of his community. She turned a page, then looked up. What I see from you is overreach dressed as concern. Whitaker opened his mouth. She lifted her hand. The petition is dismissed. Her gavel struck wood, and the sound was not a bang, but a bell. Emma's breath hitched. She pressed a palm to her mouth. Tyler grinned so wide he looked like he'd outrun the sound barrier. Sarah squeezed my forearm once hard, like congratulations, and keep breathing. Frank did not move. He stared at a spot on the table like it might rearrange itself into a better answer if he glared long enough. Elena sank back into her seat, eyes closed. A person who had lifted something heavy and finally set it down. We stepped into the hallway and the reporters found us. Flash, flash, questions like hail. I gave one answer because there was only one I wanted my kids to hear me say on record. I'm grateful, I said. I'm grateful my children were seen and that what counts was counted. Outside on the courthouse steps, the air felt newly sharpened. The headline wrote itself again. Father wins against wealthy grandfather. Judge cites pride community support. People honked as they drove by, not at me, at what we all wanted to believe still worked. Emma slipped her hand into mine. You didn't just win, she said. You showed everybody who you are. That was always the point, I said. That you would know. Tyler tugged my sleeve. Can we still move, he asked, as if a gavel could cancel mountains. We can, I said. We will. Elena lingered near the bottom step. She looked like she had rehearsed a speech and then had the sense to let it go. I'm sorry, she said. Not dramatic, not self-punishing. Just true. I know, I said. Now be better with us. I will, she said, and I believed her. The dominoes didn't stop at the courthouse door. At the country club, people who'd cut their teeth on secrecy discovered they preferred the quiet of distance. Invitations that had once appeared like clockwork stopped arriving. Frank had spent years buying rooms. You can't buy one that no longer wants you. But revenge wasn't about his isolation. It wasn't even about the petition. It was about resetting the story. The next morning, I emailed Grand Vista to confirm my start date and asked about school districts near the housing stipend radius. The HR manager wrote back with a list, efficient and kind. In the afternoon, I called the kids into the living room and showed them photos of a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony and a view that looked like a promise. Emma leaned in hopeful despite herself. Is that snow? Sometimes, I said. Sometimes it's blue sky. Sometimes it's both. Tyler pointed at a nearby field in the map inset. Is that a soccer pitch? That's a soccer pitch. Can I play there? You can try out for any team you want, I said, and the words tasted like something I could finally afford to say. That weekend we packed in a rhythm that turned into a kind of liturgy. Keep, donate, keep, toss. I held Maria's photo frame and decided it went in the front of the box, not the bottom. Emma taped labels in the pretty straight lines she always preferred. Tyler stuffed bubble wrap down his sleeves and chased himself around the couch. Elena came over with takeout and boxes, and the kind of silence that makes room for repair. People from Romano's dropped by with hugs and a brand new set of pots someone had bought without telling me who. Mr. Romano stopped at the door and handed me a card with more signatures than I realized could fit on cardstock. Inside, someone had written, "If you ever need a shift, there's a station with your name on it." It wasn't about work, it was about belonging that did not expire when you changed your zip code. The night before we left, I stood on our small balcony with both kids, the city lights flickering like candles. "Thank you," I said. And they rolled their eyes, like I'd thanked them for doing their homework. "For what?" Emma asked. "For not letting me forget what I was fighting for," I said. "We're kind of hard to miss," Tyler said, and I laughed hard enough that he grinned like he'd scored. When the moving truck pulled away, I took one last look at the window where Maria's plant had sat, and told the empty apartment the thing people say at the end of a prayer: Amen. Not goodbye. Just so be it. We drove west. The mountains rose like the kind of truth you can't argue with. At the resort, the lobby smelled like cedar and coffee. The HR manager handed me a stack of onboarding papers and the keys to a temporary unit. The kids claimed corners of the living room and a patch of balcony with a view of trees that made Emma exhale like someone who'd been holding her breath for years. That first night we ate pizza on the floor and made lists. Emma's were in neat columns, scholarship deadlines, and campus tour dates. Tyler's were in scrawls, tryouts, cleats, maybe skiing ? Mine had one line I underlined twice: "Keep showing up." We didn't hear from Frank for weeks. Then the call came not from a lawyer, but from Elena. "He's at the Family Crisis Center," she said. "Volunteering." The judge suggested community engagement in her closing remarks. He went. At first, to save face. Now, I don't know, he listens a lot. "I'm glad he's listening," I said, and I meant it. Don't mistake this for a story that tied itself up in a bow overnight. Pride does not evaporate. It erodes. Redemption doesn't sprint. It limps. But something shifted for all of us. The victory in court had not been punishment. It had been permission to live, to move, to try again. On a Sunday afternoon, a month after the move, Emma stood in a quiet corner of our new kitchen and read me the first paragraph of a scholarship essay. It started with a memory of Romano's and ended with the sentence she had stolen from me. "And made better. We are not our bank statements. We are the people we show up for." Tyler scored a goal that made his coach shout and his teammates bury him in a pile of joy. I went to work and came home tired, the good kind. The kind that ends with the sound of kids complaining about whose turn it is to do dishes. Public revenge had turned into private relief. The petition had been dismissed, the court had spoken, the community had chosen. But the deeper win was quieter. It was a kitchen table that belonged to us again without someone else's opinion seated in the empty chair. And because life likes symmetry, the paper ran one more piece that week, a follow-up about the case that had lit up their comment section. It talked about Frank volunteering about grandparents who learned late and fathers who learned early, about a town that discovered it was better at rallying than at watching. They ran a small photo of me and the kids in front of the resort, all of us squinting into bright sky. And for once a caption said exactly enough starting over. That was Act 4 for us, not a victory lap, not a sermon, not even a curtain call. Just the part after the reversal where you learn the shape of a life you get to keep. The pride that tried to tear it down had been seen, named, and sent home empty-handed. What remained was ours to build, not in front of a crowd this time, but in rooms, with doors we could close, and a view that looked a lot like a future. Colorado gave us something we hadn't had in years: air. Crisp, thin mountain air that stung the lungs and reminded you you were alive. The apartment was modest, but the balcony overlooked peaks that seemed to watch over us. Emma decorated her room with photos of Maria, arranging them like stars. Tyler plastered his walls with soccer posters. And I let myself breathe without waiting for the next blow. The job at Grand Vista Resort was steady, demanding in a way that felt like building, not just surviving. The salary checks came like clockwork, enough to cover bills and tuck away savings. For the first time in years, the word future didn't feel like a threat. Emma flourished. She spent nights bent over her laptop, scholarship essays glowing on the screen. When the first acceptance letter arrived with aid attached, she cried into my arms, shaking with relief. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. Tyler darted in yelling party until the three of us ended up laughing through tears, a knot of joy, in our small living room. Tyler thrived too. His new coach pulled me aside after practice. "He's raw, but he's hungry," he said. "With the right training, he'll go far." I smiled because it wasn't about going far. It was about him believing he could. Meanwhile, the fallout reached Frank in ways even I hadn't expected. At his country club, people who had once flocked to him now turned away. Invitations dried up. Friends avoided eye contact. Pride had been his currency, and now it bought him nothing. Then came Judge McAllister's quiet sentence at the end of her ruling, "Mr. Davidson, perhaps you would benefit from time at the Family Crisis Center. Consider it not punishment, but perspective." He went reluctantly, a man playing at humility. At first, Elena said he stood in the corner, stiff arms crossed. But then he began listening. To mothers juggling 2 jobs. To fathers showing up late from shifts, but still making bedtime stories. To children who clung to parents that society said weren't enough. He listened, and something in him cracked. Elena changed too. She started volunteering at the center, counseling families torn by custody fights. She spoke openly about her own mistake, about how loyalty to pride can disguise itself as love. Redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in showing up after you've failed. And she did. Life moved in rhythms. Morning drives to practice. Late night talks over tea. Laughter that sounded less like survival and more like living. For the first time since Maria's diagnosis, I woke up without bracing myself for disaster. But then, one autumn evening, the call came. Frank had collapsed at the club. A mild heart attack, the doctor said. He would recover, but slowly. Elena's voice over the phone trembled. "He asked if you and the kids would visit." I sat with the phone against my ear, staring at the mountains. My first instinct was no. He had put us through hell. But Emma placed her hand on my arm. "Dad," she said softly, "he's still Grandpa. We need to go. Not for him, for us." So we went. The hospital room was stark, the kind of place that stripped away pretense. Frank lay smaller than I had ever seen him, tubes, running his eyes dim, with something I had never associated with him, fear. Tyler gripped my hand tighter. Emma stepped forward, voice steady. "We forgive you," she said quietly, "but we don't forget." The words struck deeper than any verdict. Frank's lips trembled. He nodded slowly. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice fragile. His eyes moved to me. "Robert, I'm sorry." I looked at him and for the first time saw not the banker, not the tyrant, but a man laid bare by age and regret. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It just released us from being chained to it. Weeks later, Frank surprised us again. He asked Elena to help him organize a community event at the Family Crisis Center. He wanted to speak. At first, I thought it was another performance, but we went because Emma asked. The hall was filled with families like ours, struggling, scarred, surviving. Frank walked to the podium, slowly leaning on the stand. He cleared his throat and began. "I used to believe money solved everything," he said. "I thought wealth could replace love, that opportunity could replace presence. I nearly destroyed my family because of that pride. I stood in a courtroom trying to take children from the only parent who had always stood by them. I told myself it was for their good, but it was for my pride." He paused, his voice trembling. "I cannot undo the harm, but I can own it, and I can ask forgiveness, not just from my family, but from all of you. If you hear anything, let it be this: true success isn't measured by money. It's measured by how fiercely you protect family when others try to tear it apart." Silence fell, not empty, but full, like the air right before a storm breaks. Then applause rose, steady, heartfelt, carrying something like grace. Emma squeezed my hand. Tyler leaned against me, whispering, "He finally gets it, Dad." Afterward, Frank shuffled to us. His eyes were wet. "Robert," he said, "I can't give Maria back. I can't erase what I tried to do. But if you'll let me, I want to spend what time I have being the grandfather they deserve." I nodded slowly. "On our terms," I said. He bowed his head. "On your terms." Life in Colorado kept unfolding. Emma received a full scholarship offer from a state university. She wrote in her essay, "We are not defined by what we lack, but by who stands with us when the world doubts." She won not just the scholarship, but a standing ovation when her essay was read aloud at orientation. Tyler played with fire in his legs and joy in his heart. His team made the regional finals. He looked for me in the stands, and when he saw me, his grin widened every time. As for me, I kept showing up at the resort, at the kitchen table, in the stands, in the moments Maria had begged me to never miss. One evening, Emma handed me a letter she'd written. "I want to send this," she said. It was addressed to Romanos. "You believed in Dad when others doubted him. You stood by us when it felt like the world was against us. Thank you for proving that family isn't just blood, it's community." I folded the letter and kissed her forehead. They'll treasure this. That night we sat on the balcony, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky burned gold and crimson, the kind of colors that make you believe in second chances. Tyler leaned against me, Emma on my other side. I thought of Maria, of her laughter, of her last words about presence mattering more than prestige. And I knew she would be proud. Our story hadn't been about victory in court or humiliation at a birthday party. It had been about endurance, about a father who refused to step aside, about children who saw through wealth to find love, about a family scarred but unbroken. Frank's redemption didn't erase his betrayal, but his apology mattered. Elena's change mattered. Emma's courage mattered. Tyler's joy mattered. And my persistence, flawed, weary, but unyielding, mattered most of all. Because in the end, our legacy wasn't the scars left by betrayal. It was the healing born of forgiveness. It was the truth that when love is tested, it grows stronger. As the mountains darkened into silhouettes and the first stars blinked awake, I wrapped my arms around my children. "We made it," I whispered. Emma smiled, her eyes on the horizon. "We always will, Dad." And so the story closed, not with vengeance, but with peace. The kind of peace that lingers like the last light of day, reminding you that even after the darkest storms, the sun always rises again. Stories like Robert's are exactly why true family revenge exists. To show that sometimes the best revenge is simply being a better person. If this story of family betrayal and ultimate justice touched your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more tales where love conquers greed and community beats corruption. Drop a comment telling us Team Robert or Team Frank. Your true family revenge stories might just become our next video.